All right, you guys, this is your next Q&A. Like I always say, if I didn't get you on this one, I'll get you on the next one. If you guys got any questions, get them in now, as we'll be doing another Q&A next week. So let's get straight to it. Exiler937 wants to know, your first night as official NF, what was going through your head? What was your first act as an NF? And were there people questioning your authority being new to the organization? If you're asking what my first night was like as an official NF member, keep in mind I was still in custody at San Quentin. After I was recruited, I still had another 3 or 4 months left on my parole violation, so there was no big welcoming party. Prior to getting pulled, and even after, I was still being indoctrinated and schooled on the NF Constitution, so that's basically how it was. I was recruited by Mike MC Castillo and Arthur Big Smiley Ramirez, both longtime high-ranking C's from Salas. So aside from studying some of the topics they were giving me, we were also required to do hundreds and hundreds of burpees. I understand the whole concept of maintaining the physical aspect of training, and I understand why so much emphasis is placed on staying in shape, as the physical is as equally as important as the mental. But the one thing I didn't understand about C's like Big Smiley is why younger C's were required to do a ridiculous amount of burpees in order to satisfy their expectations. I get the whole purpose for building up your endurance, the physical conditioning, and why it's so important to have superhuman stamina. But what I never understood is why breaking your back equated to standard NF training. C's were expected to do hundreds and hundreds of burpees as part of the induction and training process. And that was just something that you were expected to do daily. When I became an NF member in 1994, I must have lost around 60 or 70 pounds because of all the damn burpees I was required to do. But I became to love them too. Burpees are a good exercise as they hit a lot of different muscle groups at the same time, but they're also bad on your back, knees, elbows, and shoulders. It's a lot of repetitive, isolated movements. After all those years of doing thousands and thousands of burpees, my back sometimes goes out on me. My knees are always sore, and I've got torn ligaments and tendons in both of my shoulders. So the drunk investor wants to know, when you were active, what was your understanding of the cause? What did it mean to you? My understanding of the cause was this. The cause was the struggle. All the moving parts and everything that entailed fighting and engaging with all those who were attempting to oppress the Norteño following. It was the act and willingness to spill our sweat and blood fighting to establish main lines throughout the state of California so that all Norteños could do their time without being threatened or without any outside interference from the ops. For those of you who are more familiar with the NF, the NR, and Norteño history, all the stories that you used to hear in the past about Norteños getting taxed, getting abused, having their personal possessions taken, or being subjected to the inflictions that other opposing groups would subject them to, were being done because standing alone, the Norteños didn't have the training or backing they needed in order to stand up to some of these groups. Back in the 80s, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia had fierce reputations, and if you weren't affiliated with them, or weren't a sympathizer, you were susceptible to becoming a target. Norteños were looked at as the farmers, the farmeros, the migrant farm workers who were easy prey. So after the NF evolved, and years later, after the NR was created, the cause was born and the struggle began. Some of us really were part of paving the way, and some of us really did make sacrifices that ended up transcending into where we are today. Others make claim to have been the catalyst and pioneers, but these claims are baseless. Because you wore a red jersey, put a red rag in your pocket, and identified yourself as a Norteño, doesn't mean your name's etched in the history books. This is an affront to those of us who really have been in the field, those of us who spent years behind the walls for crimes and sacrifices committed in the name of the cause, those who had suffered indictments and losses directly attributed to pushing the cause forward. Real carnales, real hermanos, and real end souls, not just those claiming to be and never were. The cause was also fighting for social status of equality, ensuring that the Norteño collective benefited from the same luxuries and privileges that all the other group segments out there benefited from themselves. That the Norteños got their slice of the pie. If other groups on them lines had these luxuries, then we wanted them too. If there were jobs that had some of the higher pay numbers available out there, like working in the canteen, clerical, or other good jobs, then we wanted them too. If all the other group segments had 2 handball courts, 7 benches, 7 tables, 5 phones per building, and an area on the weight pile, then we wanted our issue as well. It's not about compromising or negotiating either. If we have it coming, we either get it, we got it, or we went to war. The NR members were the soldados. They were the first ones to man the front lines and engage if that's what it had to come down to. So this is what the cause was about to me. Genuinely caring about the future and well-being of the Norteño people. Showing true carnalismo and not putting monetary gain, power, or greed before your fellow brothers. Establishing the main lines, building up the security of the people, setting positive examples, affording the benefit of the doubt, and being true believers in what the movement truly represented is what the cause meant to me. So Echo wants to know, how long did it take you to become an NF member? From the time I entered the prison system, it took me almost 5 years before I would become an NF member. I hit San Quentin in 1989 and was recruited as an NR member during that same year. In 1994, I was approached about making a commitment to the NF while I was in San Quentin doing another parole violation. When I paroled a few months later in 1994, I was a fully functioning member of the Familia. I developed into a potential NF prospect pretty fast. During the time I was an NR member, I did everything that was asked of me, and through my own attributes elevated within that movement expeditiously. I never fell into question, I never debated or questioned anything that was ever asked of me. I developed leadership abilities early on as a young NR member. I was hungry and striving for education, and I took my commitment to the NR serious. There's no set time frame insofar as how long it might take someone to elevate to the status of an NF member. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 3 years. It could even be 1 year. It just depends, and there's a lot of different things that factor into it. A lot of the times it just depends on when you get the opportunity to be around the right C who has the authority or the authorization to invoke recruitment power. So El Blanco wants to know, have you ever come across a CO that put the badge and squared up with an inmate without reporting the incident? Yes, I have. In fact, I've been in that situation myself. It happened in the Santa Clara County Jail. I was housed in an area of the jail that they called Area 51, or ADSE. There's only 4 cells back there, and it's so deep under the jail security, and it's so hidden in the cuts that they call it Area 51. I believe I mentioned this in one of my previous Q&As, so I'm just going to give you the short version. So there was an officer there at the jail named Bailey. He don't work there anymore behind some similar shit, so I don't have a problem mentioning him by name. Anyway, me and this particular officer never cared for each other. We had bumped heads in the past, and the day we got into it, he had been assigned to work back there on our tier. I forget what the incident was over, but if I recall, he had disrespected one of the homies that was back there with me, and I spoke up telling him something along the lines of, "I see you're still up to your old tricks, playing your little bitch ass games, huh, Bailey?" I forget exactly what he said, but he said something to the effect of, "Oh, okay, you want to run your mouth, huh? I'll be back later after count to see how tough you want to really be today." I told him, "Just make sure you come back by yourself." Keeping it real, I honestly didn't think nothing was going to come of it, and I just went back to doing what I was. But about an hour later, the front door slammed open, and all you can hear is all kinds of keys rattling, which told me that a bunch of COs were coming back there. I didn't even connect it to the earlier incident. I just thought they were coming in to shake us down or something. So when I get up on my door, I look and I see that it's Bailey, 3 other officers, and a sergeant. They come in, unplug the TV that was on a roll cart, and then they push it away from my door. Then the sergeant turns his back to us and stands there as if to purposely not watch what was going on. At that point, it became obvious what was going on. These fools had come back there to get with my program, and the sergeant was giving them a freebie. Bailey pops my tray slot and tells me, "Cuff it up." I told him, I ain't cuffing up shit. Get the fuck away from my door. I told you to come back by yourself. He says, I'm only gonna tell you one more time. Cuff it up or we're coming in. I told Bailey, hey homegirl, if you step foot in this cell, I'm telling you right now, it's on. With that said, the door opened and they piled in and the fight was on. While I was there at the jail for close to 10 years, this was probably the best fight I had gotten into as far as with the COs. But even then, this fool didn't give me that heads up. This incident ended up turning into an assault and a spearing because of my co-defendant Joel Beta. He tried doing what he could to help me by reaching through his tray slot with his channel changer and using the pencil he had affixed to the tip to poke one of the COs in the head. I've seen other COs go in cells with other inmates before, giving them that heads up, and I've seen it go both ways. I've seen the CO come out on top, and then I've seen the CO get his wig split. Believe it or not, a lot of cops in San Quentin are known for giving those types of head up fades. So HSV JO707GH wants to know, now that you're deep in Operation Devil Horns, do you find the book a bit exaggerated or embellished? Was yours or your barrios dealing with MS as serious as the book states, or did you view them as pesky paisas or new upstarts, and not a true threat? New upstarts. I don't get that. I'll keep it real with you. It was embellished to a degree, and there were things that I knew weren't true about it, but it was nothing over the top. There were things that were minor enough in nature that really didn't impact the authenticity of the storyline, but it was just the author trying to hype up the presence that MS-13 had in the city. We knew where they were at. They used to kick it at a small park, the Mission Park that's mentioned in the book, and then at Dolores Park, which is right at the top of the street, that same street that they kick it on. I'll be honest with you though, MS-13 was definitely out there, and we clashed with them several times, but the Sureños on 19th and Mission used to kick up more dust than them. As far as gangbanging, they were a lot more active too. Like the book says, MS-13 in the city were more into business and making money than they were into gangbanging. You asked if they were viewed as pesky little paisas, and if my hood dealt with them as much as the book portrayed. Not even close, brother. I was kicking back earlier thinking about past clashes that we had with them dudes, and I can only remember a few. And this was during the entire time that they were out there and when their presence was noticeable. Most of the clashes we had with these guys were downtown in the Tenderloin district or up by Dolores Park, and even then, this was because we were pressing them. Most of our focus was on 19th, but because they also had a hood right there on 20th, we used to hit both hoods at the same time. If these guys were putting in work like the book says they were isolated incidents that occasionally happen. So SFC wants to know, in your opinion, do you think the MA and NF will come together in our lifetime? It seems like a smart move, as I'm an outsider looking in. Does it make sense to do so? Do you think the NF are the ones stopping this peace? It seems the MA are always agreeing to peace, but something always breaks down and ends the talks. Look, people might not like my answer, but I'm here to give my honest opinion, not to be politically correct. No, I don't think the NF and the MA will join forces and become one organization in our lifetime. I think the most you're gonna see as far as these two together is what you've already seen. Trust me, it's only been a couple years since this agreement to end hostilities has been put into effect, and a lot has been learned already. Not just how the Norteños and Sureños have interacted, but even more importantly, how leadership from both of these groups has interacted. One of the downsides that's already become an issue is that good gente from both sides have been wronged and were turned on just out of a strong inclination and a misguided predilection for wanting to prove a level of loyalty to each other. From what I've heard, there's also a lot of lines that are also being drawn by certain individuals who act on their own belief system. And as long as things like that are going on, there's always going to be problems and ill feelings. As far as whether or not I think it would be good, it depends on what you're applying that to. If you're referring to monetary gains and from a business perspective, of course it would be beneficial to both organizations. These two organizations could run the board and control the entire prison system. Everyone knows it too. They're too powerful, and together, there's just nobody that could stop that kind of power. This is why it's always benefited CDCR and some of the other prison organizations to see the NF and the MA engaged in this continued conflict. With regard to the last part of your question, yes, the MA has always been willing to enter into these types of peace accords with the NF, not because it fears the NF or as any form of subservience, but I think more so because the MA understands the benefits and the advantages that are involved with any form of peace treaty. It's as simple as that. The NF, on the other hand, has been the more skeptical of the two when it's come to any peace treaties or standstills with the MA. Although the NF understands how peace amongst these two groups would benefit them both financially, I don't think the NF places as much emphasis on making money out there on the main lines as the MA does. At least not when it involves peace. In the big scheme of things, it's just not that much of a priority. So Libby wants to know, what is your biggest regret and why? What are you most proud of during your past life and during your life? My biggest regret in life is making all the wrong decisions when I was younger and pursuing some of the things that I did when I got older. Things like doing everything I did to further my gang status, and of course, all the things I did to elevate my status once I was in. I regret hurting and victimizing some of the people that I did, especially the civilians that didn't deserve it. I realized that most of this was done or attributed to the fact that I learned early on as a young gang member that the more violent I was, the more blood I spilled, and the more people I hurt, whether it was in prison or on the streets, that's how I attained more respect. I obviously can't do nothing to take any of that back now, and I don't dwell on it. But I still think back on all the unnecessary, aimless shit I did. Another one of my regrets is not showing more value or appreciation to members of my family when I had a chance. This is something I took for granted, like a lot of people do. Not calling more often just to see how they were doing. Not dropping by when I had the chance just to spend a few minutes in their company, and things like that. What a lot of us seem to lose focus of is that life can take any one of us at any given time. We're not always fortunate enough to get those early warning signs that some of us do. The outward signs that tell you, okay, I gotta spend more time with my niece, my nephew, my little sister, moms or pops, because they're sick and I know it's coming. Sometimes with the drop of a dime, from one day to the next, they're gone. Bam, just like that, they're gone. This sometimes leaves us carrying that guilt because of something we didn't get a chance to say, a bridge we didn't get to mend, or an expression we didn't get to express. I spent too much of my life incarcerated, invested in NF affairs, and doing whatever I could as an individual, as a C, to push the O forward. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of camaraderie and lifelong bonds that are built with fellow brothers or carnales, but I just think we sometimes neglect to show our biological families, the ones who will always be there through thick and thin, that we value and appreciate them too. When we make these lifelong commitments and we invest, or obligate ourselves to these affairs, they don't get a say in it. They don't get to address how they feel, and they are just forced to accept whatever choices we made. Choices that will inevitably affect and impact not just you, but them as well. Another part of it is lacking the urgency to make necessary changes for the betterment. Choices involving self-improvement and not placing enough emphasis on the fact that life is passing us by. Wasted time, wasted days, and wasted years is time you can't get back. Once it's gone, period. Although somewhat powerless at the time to change things or make things different than what ended up happening in the end, I regret the fact that my mom and other family members didn't get to see me come home or to see some of the changes that they always wished I'd someday make. As far as what I'm most proud of now is the fact that I opened up my own mind. I took the blinders off and allowed myself to see the things that I never knew existed in this life. When we live within that lifestyle, completely submerged in gang politics, and we completely and totally commit ourselves to fulfilling all the obligations that we must, it's virtually impossible to allow yourself to live life with any real sense of enjoyment or true purpose. We can't, otherwise we come up short or fail to live up to the expectations that we are bound by. Luckily for me, I found another wife after Vicky that helped me restore that purpose and recreate the real purpose that I'm living today. You have to have a strong partner, someone who's just as strong as you, and someone who you treat as an equal, not because you have to, but because you want to. At times when I wavered or wasn't strong enough to make all the right decisions, she's been the one who's helped me navigate through life, and she's been the one who's also had to be that voice of reason. When you've been through some of the hardships that some of us have been, especially those of us who have been to prison and who are deep in the trenches, life gets a little harder to navigate through. It's been at times like this that I've learned to appreciate the fact that I didn't have a doormat, someone to walk on. Instead, I had someone who was also intelligent, ambitious, grounded, stable, and mentally strong to overcome some of the challenges that life has thrown our way. Like they say, behind every strong man stands a strong woman. Someone who doesn't walk behind you, who doesn't walk before you, and who truly understands that she has to walk beside you. I was lucky enough to find that again, and this is what gives me my purpose now. This is what my cause and my purpose is all about today. So Morgan Hill wants to know, can you elaborate on when you were in high desert? Shit, I don't remember when I was. I was never in high desert. I was in Susanville, which is basically across the street. Since you asked about it, I'm just gonna give you a quick timeline of what happened while I was there. I hit Susanville in '89 and stayed on the Sierra Yard for 2 weeks before I got into my first incident. From there, I went to Adseg, where I stayed for almost 2 months. From Adseg, I got kicked out to the Lassen Yard, which is the level 3 yard. I stayed out there for a couple months until I caught my first weapons possession. I was en route to hit a target during a time when there was a lot of tension on the yard, and they were watching for any signs of aggression. From there, myself and another homeboy went back to Adseg, where I'd stay this time for about another 4 months. While in Adseg, we picked up another DA referral for stabbing an individual named Sapo from Oakland. I sat there until I basically had enough time to do most of a 16-month shoot. The remaining time on my shoot was suspended, and I was shot back out to the 3 yard. This time I stayed out there on the yard for about another 4 months until I got caught up in another group stabbing. This incident led to me getting validated and losing my mainline status for the next 22 years. While there in Adseg, waiting for my validation package to go through the process, I picked up 2 more stabbings, another weapons possession, and an assault and battery with GBI on one of my cellies, and multiple physical altercations on the yard. I stayed there in Adseg for about a good 26-27 months before I finally paroled on June 4th, 1992. So Pelon X8 wants to know, when you guys study battle tactics, did you read from historical military tactics or modern small squad ones? Both. It was actually a variety of different military tactics. Keep in mind that a lot of the C's that were being recruited in the 70s were former Marines. So they were bringing a lot of that specific military training with them and were passing it on to some of the other NF recruits. Then there was a lot of Middle Eastern philosophy such as Sun Tzu, Mao Zedong, Machiavelli, Leo Strauss, and other revolutionary and military-inspired books to help develop that urban guerrilla warfare mentality, i.e. George Jackson, Che Guevara, Socrates, Robert Greene, etc., etc. Honestly, NF members aren't supposed to be out there gangbanging. We used to identify ourselves with being more involved in organized crime, being an organized crime family, but it took me several years before I would make that complete transition and where I started to understand why this was so important. However, before I did, and during the time when that transition was still being made, this type of training took my gangbanging to another level. When I was still out there going at it with 19th Street before I started being exposed to more of this type of intensive training, my gangbanging was standard. There was nothing above par about it. We go down there, do a couple drive-bys, maybe jump out on a couple of our unsuspecting ops, stab a couple, beat one down, etc., etc. There was nothing exemplary about it. However, in retrospect, when I reflect back on it now and how being exposed to that type of intensive training changed me, it becomes obvious how different my mentality had developed. Instead of just going down there and employing the typical things that gangbangers do when engaging with your adversaries, I was now orchestrating and coordinating strategic attacks, i.e. flushing out the opposition and setting up 3- and 4-way strike zones, coordinating walk-up hits or drive-up hits, where I was having brothers walk up or drive up to targets wearing blue LA Dodger baseball caps or jerseys, and then having them shoot the target at close range. But these guys were doing the same thing to us. It was on out there in the city back in the 90s. But these were all things that I never implemented before when I was just gangbanging on a substandard level myself. I'm sure that this is probably the case with a lot of other NF or even NR members themselves. The advancement becomes more evident and it manifests based on certain things that they personally implement in the field. In simple terms, there was just a lot more planning and strategizing in the things I was doing personally that I never would have even thought about doing before I was exposed to this type of tactical training. Law enforcement tactics, psychological and mental warfare tactics are other areas that we were encouraged to study as well. How to beat someone without touching them by just incorporating false propaganda and psychological warfare tactics is a heightened level of training. Understanding people's tics, body language, eye contact, interrogation, and manipulation tactics, and just the overall understanding of psychology are all other key components of this type of intensive NF training that provides seasoning and grade to its members. So KB8 Killer wants to know, maybe you covered this in another video, but I'm curious about the origins of the NF and how it was created in response to the MA, rather than just to consolidate power and make money as Northern Latinos. This is covered in typical NF History 101. Now, but seriously, the NF never evolved as an organization whose primary purpose was to generate revenue or to harness the type of power that would come later. The evolvement of the Familia was based solely in response to the MA's transgressions and the way in which they began to wield their power. They started victimizing the raza, all those who didn't buy into their propaganda, and all those who didn't sympathize with their belief system. By the MA's own actions, it actually precipitated the NF's evolvement. They began speaking out in secrecy, and over the course of time, they realized that they had a huge, overwhelming support base. It just needed to be harnessed and pulled together. The MA's assailants and those that became victims were the ones who grew tired and who eventually banded together to create a strong, united front. A united front that would stand up and fight back against the big bully on the block that the MA had become. It was during this brief time period that the cause was still a just and beautiful thing. At the time, it still meant something. There was a deeper purpose, a deeper underlying purpose, and the NF was an organization that truly believed in protecting, defending, and looking out for the people's welfare and best interests. This is what changed, and the NF only became another organization with similar parallels to the MA after it took its vision to the streets in its pursuit of power and money. This was the beginning of the end when the true cause and the Norteño spirit died. When protecting Norteños out there on the main lines became a secondary purpose, a purpose that was put on the back burners behind revenue and power on the streets. I was back there in the shoe and I seen firsthand how the cause became a purgatory, aimless purpose. Instead of C's being concerned about what was happening in Folsom, High Desert, Salinas Valley, Coalinga, or San Quentin, they were more concerned with meeting monetary quotas, monetary gains, and self-serving power grabs. Revenue bred corruption and became one of the primary distractions that deviated the NS fundamental purpose. So Famero, my boy, wants to know, did you ever function with any brothers from South Monterey County? I know Fabian from King City was in your book, but I'm asking about functioning on the streets. Yeah, Famero, I functioned with quite a few homies from South Monterey when I was functioning in the Salinas Regiment, but one of the brothers that stood out to me was Jacinto Shorte Rueles. Although I believe he's actually from Salinas, he lives out in Gonzales. Shorte was one of those solid little homies that you knew you could depend on when you needed him. When me and Smokey were out there running around traveling to Sacramento, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Watsonville, Modesto, Visalia, etc., Shorte would hold things down on the home front, which allowed us to stay focused on other issues in the field. So Auntie wants to know, can you list 10 of your favorite oldie jams like Forever by the Ebonies, the one you dropped in your last live before Christmas? Okay, Auntie, here's some of my favorite jams, oldies, old school, or throwbacks. These are just off the top of my head right now. If I thought about it, in an hour, I'd probably remember some others that might take precedent over these. But better yet, I'll give you 30. Cause I Love You by Lenny Williams, It's Forever by the Ebonies, It'll Be Sweeter Tomorrow by the Escorts, Wish That You Could Be Mine by the Manhattans, I Destroyed Your Love by Special Delivery, Solid Love Affair by Anthony Watson, Yesterday I Had the Blues by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Am I Losing You by the Manhattans, Be My Girl by the Dramatics, The Love We Had Stays on My Mind by the Dells, It's Been a Long Time by the New Birth, I Can't Get Over You by the Dramatics, Summer Madness by Kool and the Gang. I listen to this when I just want to block out everything, when I just want to zone out. Seriously, man. You're in your car, turn that motherfucker up and listen to that shit. It's all instrumental. I Miss You by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Love Jones by The Brighter Side of Darkness, Stairway to Heaven by the OJs, Fell For You by the Dramatics, When You Get Right Down to It by the Delphonics, Pusher Man by Curtis Mayfield. This song has a history behind it. The song's okay, but the memories that are attached is what makes it a hit with me. This Is a Man's World by my boy James Brown, If You Think You're Lonely Now by Bobby Womack, Turn Off the Lights by Teddy Pendergrass, Medley Fact of Love, He'll Be There When the Sun Goes Down by Bobby Womack, Summer by War. There's just something about this song while drinking and barbecuing in the park that never gets old, man. Reasons by Earth, Wind and Fire, Love Ballad by LTD, Soul by War, Old Girl by the Shylights, Old Honey by Delegation, and you know you can't forget motherfucking Marvin Gaye, Inner City Blues, man. So that's 30 of them for you right there that I be rocking all the time, man. So Woody from D wants to know, what's your take on the saying, I don't wish prison on nobody, not even my worst enemy? Look, I think that this statement holds a lot of weight, especially for those of us who have been to prison. No matter how much we might not like someone, no matter how much we might want to inflict harm on someone who we don't necessarily care for, and no matter how much we might despise someone, prison isn't the place most of us want to see someone go. Because we know what kind of pain and misery prison can inflict on someone's soul. Taking someone's freedom and taking their ability to move freely around is the absolute worst kind of punishment and torment you can subject someone to. Even in situations where people's actions might seem to contradict this statement, I still believe it holds true. If I had a choice, I'd rather bash in my worst enemy's brains than to see him go to prison. But at the end, sometimes it's not our choice. So the Martin 9400 wants to know, do you believe the NF pulled Mexican Mike as a way to make up for him being wrongfully stabbed in Quentin? Do you believe that if Mike wasn't pulled, he would have walked away from the O? Since the late 70s, early 80s, are there any NF members' murders that weren't attributed to internal house cleaning? Motherfucking Martin 9400, always coming with the heat, man. Always with a multitude of good questions, too. As far as the NF pulling Mexican Mike, I wasn't out there when he was recruited. I had just had a meeting with him and Big Roach in Ukiah, but not long after that, I went back to the joint on a parole violation and he stayed out. So while I was locked up, I continued to stay in touch with him, and I know for a fact that he continued to function with and amongst other NF members that were also out there at that time. Chico from Salas was working with him. I know he continued working with Big Roach until we found out that he was a federal CI. But I was already locked up and I was gone even after he got killed. What I do know and can say about him getting hit and then recruited is this. I don't believe his recruitment was a way to compensate for the bad call that he was subjected to. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that. The NF doesn't just routinely hand out free memberships when that kind of stuff happens. Like I said, I was already locked up back when he got pulled, but I know for a fact that there were actually 3 things that factored into him being recruited. Foremost, Eminem was a huge asset to the NF, and the NF does have a history of recruiting prospects if they prove to be worthy assets. A big bag of money or a big bag of dope can move you up that list of potential candidates for recruitment. I've seen this happen in similar situations where someone either had access to a tremendous amount of wealth or they just had access at the bag. A lot of people knew it, and the NF wanted to lock down all those resources that he brought with him. But that was only one part of it. The fact that Eminem showed his mettle and integrity despite being unjustly hit proved he was the type of prospect the NF was seeking. He never lost his step, nor did he ever lose faith in his beliefs as a norteño. That's what put him on the fast track, and that's what made him a standout. The other thing that was out of serious concern is that the FBI had already flipped several people close to him in the Operation Black Widow investigation, and this was a way of isolating him. Special Agent Natalie Fallon with the FBI, who was also Lizard's personal driver, had already recruited one other low-level East Bay C and was trying to recruit others. We knew who it was, as he had also testified in front of the grand jury, but we knew that this source was close to him, and we knew he was an active CI, so we just stayed away from him. But recruiting Eminem was an insurance plan and was a way of pulling him away from that whole fiasco. As for your next question, as to whether I think Eminem would have walked away if he wouldn't have been recruited, no, I don't. I knew Eminem, and he was a solid dude. He had already decided that he wasn't going to check out long before he even knew that he was going to be pulled. He was a solid dude, and he just wasn't going to allow that to make him or break him either way. In closing up with your last question, not that I'm aware of, I mean, all the hits that went down from as far back as the 70s and 80s were all somewhat attributed to house cleaning. Whether it was behind misconduct, some type of organizational infraction, using hardcore drugs, treason, or whatever the reason was that might have got them in bad standings, it's all attributed to cleaning house or taking out the trash. So my boy Machete wants to know, what is the reasoning for continuously reading the Constitution day after day, even after knowing it and practicing it year after year? The whole purpose or reasoning behind it, Machete, is so that it becomes second nature. It becomes deeply instilled and deeply ingrained within your thinking patterns. It becomes you and who you are as an individual. We refer to the NF Constitution as the Bible because we studied it in a religious type of fashion. That was the whole purpose for reading it. Regardless of how well you knew something or how many times you studied something, our mantra was always that we could never learn enough, that the indoctrination process is an ongoing process that continues for the duration of your life. So Alex True wants to know, during the Cork and Shoe Wars or the Gladiator days, did you ever go heads up with an MA or AB member? How'd that go? And with who? Yes, I did, many times. I got into it with an AB named Frank Pancho Clemens. I got into it with two other ABs that were Sellies, Mountain and Beaver. There were also several NLR members I got into it with as well. I got into it with an NLR member named Devil out of Orange County, who had the keys for the NLR members that were there, and I got into it with another NLR member named Night Owl from San Bernardino. As far as MA members that I got into it with Slick from La Rana, I got into it with Chato from Baldwin Park, Copper from Ontario, and Big Lazy from Venice. Those are the ones that I knew were MA for sure. So Left Inland wants to know, maybe your insight can shed some light on a debate I got going. If there's two crimies that caught a case together and one takes a plea for accessory and the other gets washed up, although it's a plea and it's outright flipping, is he in essence still implying the guilt on his co-defendant? Is this a dry snitching loophole or oversight? This is a common predicament that happens a lot more often than not, and it's really simple. There's no gray area here. Unfortunately, this is one of the downsides or disadvantages of having a co-defendant, or about being indicted with multiple co-defendants. You cannot enter into a plea if it in any way, shape, or form has an adverse effect on your co-defendant or crimey. You're bound by a good faith effort, and you're obligated to make sure that your legal strategies don't adversely affect your co-defendant. Like I said, this standard comes into play quite a bit when you're dealing with multiple co-defendants, and if you're not careful, this is a way for the DA to spring a trap and get you caught up. I'm sure this is already well known, but your attorney is an extension of you. He can't start burning other people involved in the case and doing whatever he has to in order to get you the best deal possible. This is how things start getting funky when attorneys start making underhanded deals and backdooring co-defendants in order to get their client the best deal they can. This is actually a strategic tactic that a lot of the DAs employ in order to pit crimies against each other. The one with a relatively minor record will be offered a deal that he can't refuse, sometimes practically letting the guy go or offering him a deal that will cut him loose soon thereafter. Meanwhile, the guy with the extensive record, or who they feel is more culpable in the crime they committed, will be impacted by his crimey's guilty plea, and this can actually be used later as a bad faith showing of entering into an admission of guilt for them both, or as aggravated circumstances. This is why it is your responsibility to ask your attorney how a guilty plea might affect your crime and what type of stipulation guidelines are attached to it. In some cases, you can enter into a guilty plea that won't have an adverse effect on your crime if you have specific stipulations read into the minutes on the record. But it has to be stipulated in order for the legal standards to be applicable. A good example of this is how the 5 remaining principal defendants in Operation Black Widow, Cornelius Corny Tristan, Joseph Pinky Hernandez, James Tibbs Morado, Tex Marin Hernandez, and Gerald Huete Rubalcaba, worked out a deal with the federal district attorneys that actually benefited Henry Big Happy Cervantes and Albert Big Bird Laris. As part of their guilty pleas agreeing to spend the rest of their natural lives in federal prison, the sentencing guidelines stipulated that both Big Happy and Big Bird would do no more than 10 years each. These stipulations are an example of how their co-defendants benefited from the stipulations, but if you're not careful, your crime can be adversely affected if your attorney doesn't stipulate these things into the record. So Max Zuniga wants to know, when you were generating all this feria and putting it in the bank, you said you knew where the feria was going to. It was split up within the top. Why would you put your life on the line for them if you had already knew it was a sham and they would not help any of their brothers? You raise a good question, one that continues to be a crisis for a lot of good solid C's and N's. You ask why I would have continued to put my life on the line despite the fact that I knew it was all a sham. What's the alternative? What do? The prospect of walking away, of becoming a dropout, a degenerate, or someone who lost all honor within your own people is just too much to endure for most of us. This was my dilemma. Even though I had seen things transpiring and taking place within the organization that I knew were wrong, that were contradictory to our beliefs, I still couldn't bring myself to walk away or drop out like that. At times, I was thoroughly discouraged, and I even questioned my own resolve because of some of the things that I had seen myself. But still, I just couldn't bring myself to walk away and see my name go all bad with the people. I'm sure this is the same dilemma a lot of C's and even NR members who function out there have encountered themselves. And I'm sure they also felt that same level of discouragement. But believe it or not, it's just not enough to pull them away in that other direction. Years later, my position on this will be tested yet again. Even though I knew I was fighting an uphill battle in the county jail, and even though I knew I was in trouble and that I was at the risk of possibly even getting hit, I still couldn't bring myself to walk away. That's just not me. Some guys can walk off a tear. They get to a certain point to where they know and realize that it's over, that they've reached an end or an impasse in their careers. And rather to deal with it head on, whether it turns out good or bad, they ultimately choose to lock it up and walk off the tier. I don't pass judgment on those that have made that choice or have made these kinds of choices for themselves, but I just couldn't see myself doing that. Bottom line, you're gonna have to hit me and take me out the game. I'm not trying to sound like a tough guy who's beating on my chest either. I'm just simply saying that I can't do it any other kind of way. This isn't something that I just claim to stand by either. This is what I have stood by. When I was in the Santa Clara County Jail, I spent close to a year trying to convince certain individuals that I was still holding firm in my beliefs and that I had not wavered like people thought I had. When my efforts failed and basically proved to fall on deaf ears, I still continued to push on, and I didn't allow this to shake my resolve. After the first incident involving the wayward phone and the way it was precariously tossed my way, I still spent close to another 15 months continuing to prove my loyalty. Again, it continued to fall on deaf ears. When another NF member finally made his way to the county jail and found out what was going on, he concluded that I should be given the benefit of the doubt based on the fact that there was absolutely no paperwork and just based on the totality of the circumstances. It was then that I suggested that I embark on a radical campaign to get myself back on the active tier, and that's exactly what I did. I became a management problem, spearing people and assaulting people every chance I got, until the classification gang intel unit was left with no other alternative other than to put me back on the tier amongst active homeboys. I'm not glorifying my own situation, but I just wonder how many people really would have done the same thing under the same set of circumstances, knowing that they were putting themselves in harm's way. Well, I did, and I did it regardless of the fact that there was a very real threat and a very real possibility that things could have played out against me. So that's why I continue to send money, and that's why I continue to remain a part of that organization. Even in the gravest of circumstances, if things would have even gotten worse, I still couldn't just walk away and go bad like that. The only way for me to meet that end is exactly how it really did end up playing out when I was back in the Santa Clara County Jail back between 2004 and 2012. I hope you guys have enjoyed this Q&A. I'll be starting another one later this week, so if you have any questions, start getting them in now. Tomorrow, we'll be dropping another episode of Paradigm Profiles. I think you guys are going to like it. We're trying to drop profiles every day this week and as many chapters as possible. Trust me, we're working on some good content. We tried to post that removal video, but YouTube flagged us due to it violating community guidelines. However, for those of you who really want to see it, we have it posted on our Patreon page. Below is my IG. This is the only IG account I have that's active, so remember that. This hacker's new scam is to ask people to help him get a link to his old account. He claims to have gotten a new phone. He asks for your number. I wouldn't retrieve or get any links for anyone, as your whole phone can be compromised. At any rate, thank you all for your support. We'll be going live later tonight. Check our community for the time. Also, if you want a book, go through Sandman. He gets right on top of it. My IG is BoxerParadigm66187.